Mrs. Andrews sat up in bed. "Why should he say that to you?" she asked. "He wasn't such a great man, was he? I mean, didn't he try to sell Louisiana to the French or something behind Washington's back?" "He was a scoundrel," said Andrews, "but a very brilliant mind." Mrs. Andrews lay down again. "I was in hopes you weren't going to dream about him any more," she said. "I thought if I brought you up here—" "It's him or me," said Andrews grimly. "I can't stand this forever." "Neither can I," Mrs. Andrews said, and there was a hint of tears in her voice. Andrews and his host spent most of the afternoon, as Mrs. Andrews had expected, shooting at targets on the edge of the wood behind the Crowley studio. After the first few rounds, Andrews surprised Crowley by standing with his back to the huge hulk of dead tree trunk on which the target was nailed, walking 30 paces ahead in a stiff-legged, stern-faced manner, with his revolver held at arm's length above his head, then turning suddenly and firing. Crowley dropped to the ground, uninjured but scared. "What the hell's the big idea, Harry?" he yelled. Andrews didn't say anything, but started to walk back to the tree again. Once more he stood with his back to the target and began stepping off the 30 paces. "I think they kept their arm hanging straight down," Bob called to him. "I don't think they stuck it up in the air." Andrews, still counting to himself, lowered his arm, and this time, as he turned at the 30th step, he whirled and fired from his hip, 3 times in rapid succession. "Hey!" said Crowley. 2 of the shots missed the tree, but the last one hit it about 2 feet under the target. Crowley looked at his house guest oddly, as Andrews began to walk back to the tree again without a word, his lips tight, his eyes bright, his breath coming fast. "What the hell?" Crowley said to himself. "Look, it's my turn," he called, but Andrews turned, then stalked ahead, unheeding. This time, when he wheeled and fired, his eyes were closed. "Good God Almighty, man," said Crowley from the grass, where he lay flat on his stomach. "Hey, give me that gun, will you?" he demanded, getting to his feet. Andrews let him take it. "I need a lot more practice, I guess," he said. "Not with me standing around," said Crowley. "Come on, let's go back to the house and shake up a drink. I've got the jumps." "I need a lot more practice," said Andrews again. He got his practice next morning just as the sun came up, and the light was hard and the air was cold. He had crawled softly out of bed, dressed silently, and crept out of the room. He knew where Crowley kept the target pistol and the cartridges. There would be a target on the tree trunk just as high as a man's heart. Mrs. Andrews heard the shots first and sat sharply upright in bed, crying, "Harry!" almost before she was awake. Then she heard more shots. She got up, put on a dressing gown, and went to the Crowleys' door. She heard them moving about in their room. Alice opened the door and stepped out into the hall when Mrs. Andrews knocked. "Is Harry all right?" asked Mrs. Andrews. "Where is he? What is he doing?" "He's out shooting behind the studio, Bob says," Alice told her. "Bob'll go out and get him. Maybe he's had a nightmare or walked in his sleep." "No," said Mrs. Andrews, "he never walks in his sleep. He's awake." "Let's go down and put on some coffee," said Alice. "He'll need some." Crowley came out of the bedroom and joined the women in the hallway. "I'll need some, too," he said. "Good morning, Bess. I'll bring him back. What the hell's the matter with him, anyway?" He was down the stairs and gone before she could answer. She was glad of that. "Come on," said Alice, taking her arm. They went down to the kitchen. Mrs. Crowley found the butler in the kitchen, just standing there. "It's all right, Madison," she said. "You go back to bed. Tell Clothita it's all right. Mr. Andrews is just shooting a little. He couldn't sleep." "Yes, ma'am," mumbled Madison, and went back to tell his wife that they said it was all right. "It can't be right," said Clothita, "shooting pistols at this time of night." "Hush up," Madison told her. He was shivering as he climbed back into bed. "I wish that man would go away from here," grumbled Clothita. "He's got a bad look to his eyes." Andrews brightened Clothita's life by going away late that afternoon. When he and his wife got in their car and drove off, the Crowleys slumped into chairs and looked at each other and said, "Well." Crowley got up finally to mix a drink. "What do you think is the matter with Harry?" he asked. "I don't know," said his wife. "It's what Clothita would call the shoots, I suppose." He said a funny thing when I went out and got him this morning, Crowley told her. I could stand a funny thing, she said. I asked him what the hell he was doing there in that freezing air with only his pants and shirt and shoes on. I'll get him one of these nights, he said. Why don't you sleep in my room tonight, Mrs. Andrews asked her husband as he finished his scotch-and-water nightcap. You'd keep shaking me all night to keep me awake, he said. You're afraid to let me meet him. Why do you always think everybody else is better than I am? I can outshoot him the best day he ever lived. Furthermore, I have a modern pistol. He has to use an old-fashioned single-shot muzzle-loader. Andrews laughed nastily. Is that quite fair? His wife asked after a moment of thoughtful silence. He jumped up from his chair. What do I care if it's fair or not? He snarled. She got up, too. Don't be mad with me, Harry, she said. There were tears in her eyes. I'm sorry, darling, he said, taking her in his arms. I'm very unhappy, she sobbed. I'm sorry, darling, he said again. Don't you worry about me. I'll be all right. I'll be fine. She was crying too wildly to say anything more. When she kissed him good night later on, she knew it was really goodbye. Women have a way of telling when you aren't coming back. Extraordinary, said Dr. Fox the next morning, letting Andrew's dead left hand fall back upon the bed. His heart was as sound as a dollar when I examined him the other day. It has just stopped as if he had been shot. Mrs. Andrews, through her tears, was looking at her dead husband's right hand. The 3 fingers next to the index finger were closed in stiffly on the palm, as if gripping the handle of a pistol. The taut thumb was doing its part to hold that invisible handle tightly and unwaveringly. But it was the index finger that Mrs. Andrews' eyes stayed on longest. It was only slightly curved inward, as if it were just about to press the trigger of the pistol. Harry never even fired a shot, wailed Mrs. Andrews. Aaron Burr killed him the way he killed Hamilton. Aaron Burr shot him through the heart. I knew he would. I knew he would. Dr. Fox put an arm around the hysterical woman and led her from the room. He is crazy, he said to himself. Stark, raving crazy. The Figgerin of Aunt Wilma. When I was a boy, John Hance's grocery stood on the south side of Town Street, just east of 4th in the Central Market region of Columbus, Ohio. It was an old store, even then, 52 years ago, and its wide oak floorboards had been worn pleasantly smooth by the shoe soles of 3 generations of customers. The place smelled of coffee, peppermint, vinegar, and spices. Just inside the door on the left, a counter with a rounded glass front held all the old-fashioned penny candies, gumdrops, licorice whips, horehounds, and the rest, some of them a little pale with age. On the rear wall, between a barrel of dill pickles and a keg of salt mackerel and brine, there was an iron coffee grinder, whose handle I was sometimes allowed to turn. Once Mr. Hance gave me a stick of Yucatan gum, an astonishing act of generosity, since he had a sharp sense of the value of a penny. Thrift was John Hance's religion. His store was run on a strictly cash basis. He shared the cost of his telephone with the Hayes carriage shop next door. The instrument was set in a movable wooden cubicle that could be whirled through an opening in the west wall of the store. When I was 10, I used to hang around the grocery on Saturday afternoons, waiting for the telephone to disappear into the wall. Then I would wait for it to swing back again. It was a kind of magic, and I was disappointed to learn of its mundane purpose, the saving of a few dollars a month. Mr. Hance was nearly 70, a short man with white hair and a white mustache and the most alert eyes that I can remember, except perhaps Aunt Wilma Hudson's. Aunt Wilma lived on South 6th Street and always shopped at Mr. Hance's store. Mr. Hance's eyes were blue and capable of a keen concentration that could make you squirm. Aunt Wilma had black agate eyes that moved restlessly and scrutinized everybody with bright suspicion. In church, her glance would dart around the congregation, seeking out irreverent men and women whose expressions showed that they were occupied with worldly concerns or even carnal thoughts in the holy place. If she lighted on a culprit, her heavy dark brows would lower, and her mouth would tighten in righteous disapproval. Aunt Wilma was as honest as the day is long, and as easily confused when it came to what she called Figgerin as the night is dark. Her clashes with Mr. Hance had become a family legend. He was a swift and competent calculator, and nearly 50 years of constant practice had enabled him to add up a column of figures almost at a glance. He set down his columns swiftly on an empty paper sack with a stubby black pencil. Aunt Wilma, on the other hand, was slow and painstaking when it came to Figgerin. She would go over and over a column of numbers, her glasses far down on her nose, her lips moving soundlessly. To her, rapid calculation, like all the other reckless and impulsive habits of men, was tainted with a kind of godlessness. Mr. Hance always sighed when he looked up and saw her coming into his store. He knew that she could lift a simple dollar transaction into a dim and mystic realm of confusion all her own. I was fortunate enough to be present one day in 1905 when Mr. Hance's calculating and Aunt Wilma's Figgerin came together in memorable single combat. She had wheedled me into carrying her market basket on the ground that it was going to be too heavy for her to manage. Her 2 grandsons, boys around my own age, had skipped out when I came to call at their house, and Aunt Wilma promptly seized on me. A young'un, as she called everybody under 17, was not worth his salt if he couldn't help a body about the house. I had shopped with her before, under duress, and I knew her accustomed and invariable route on Saturday mornings, when 4th Street from Main to State was lined with the stands of truck gardeners. Prices were invariably low in those days, but Aunt Wilma questioned the cost, the quality, and the measure of everything. By the time she had finished her long and tedious purchases of fresh produce from the country, and we had turned east into Town Street and headed for Mr. Hance's store, the weight of the market basket was beginning to pain my arm. "Come along, child, come along," Aunt Wilma snapped, her eyes shining with the look of the Middle Western housewife engaged in hard but virtuous battle with the wicked forces of the merchandising world. I saw Mr. Hance make a small involuntary gesture with his right hand as he spied Aunt Wilma coming through the door. He had just finished with a customer, and since his assistant was busy, he knew he was in for it. It took a good half-hour for Aunt Wilma to complete her shopping for groceries, but at length everything she wanted was stacked on the counter in sacks and cans and boxes. Mr. Hance set deftly to work with his paper sack and pencil, jotting down the price of each article as he fitted it into the basket. Aunt Wilma watched his expert movements closely, like a hostile baseball fan waiting for an error in the infield. She regarded adroitness in a man as slick rather than skillful. Aunt Wilma's purchases amounted to 98 cents. After writing down this sum, Mr. Hance, knowing my aunt, whisked the paper bag around on the counter so that she could examine his addition. It took her some time, bending over and peering through her glasses, to arrive at a faintly reluctant corroboration of his Figgerin. Even when she was satisfied that all was in order, she had another go at the column of numbers, her lips moving silently as she added them up for the 3rd time. Mr. Hance waited patiently, the flat of his hands on the counter. He seemed to be fascinated by the movement of her lips. "Well, I guess it's all right," said Aunt Wilma at last, "but everything is so dear." What she had bought for less than $1 made the market basket bulge. Aunt Wilma took her purse out of her bag and drew out a $1 bill slowly and handed it over, as if it were $100 she would never see again. Mr. Hance deftly pushed the proper keys on the cash register, and the red hand on the indicator pointed to 98 cents. He studied the cash drawer, which had shot out at him. "Well, well," he said, and then, looks like I haven't got any pennies." He turned back to Aunt Wilma. "Have you got 3 cents, Mrs. Hudson?" he asked. That started it. Aunt Wilma gave him a quick look of distrust. Her Sunday suspicion gleamed in her eyes. "You owe me 2 cents, she said sharply. "I know that, Mrs. Hudson," he sighed, "but I'm out of pennies. Now, if you'll give me 3 cents, I'll give you a nickel." Aunt Wilma stared at him cautiously. "It's all right if you give him 3 cents and he gives you a nickel," I said. "Hush up," said Aunt Wilma. "I'm figgerin'." She figured for several moments, her mouth working again. Mr. Hance slipped a nickel out of the drawer and placed it on the counter. "There is your nickel," he said firmly. "Now you just have to give me 3 cents. Aunt Wilma pecked about in her purse and located 3 pennies, which she brought out carefully, one at a time. She laid them on the counter beside the nickel, and Mr. Hance reached for them. Aunt Wilma was too quick for him. She covered the 8 cents with a lean hand. "Wait now," she said, and she took her hand away slowly. She frowned over the 4 coins as if they were a difficult hand in bridge whist. She ran her lower lip against her upper teeth. "Maybe if I give you a dime," she said, "and take the 8 cents, it is 2 cents you're short, ain't it?" Mr. Hance began to show signs of agitation. 1 or 2 amused customers were now taking in the scene out of the corners of their eyes. "No, no," said Mr. Hance, "that way you would be making me a present of 7 cents. This was too much for Aunt Wilma. She couldn't understand the new and preposterous sum of 7 cents that had suddenly leaped at her from nowhere. The notion that she was about to do herself out of some money staggered her, and her eyes glazed for a moment like a groggy prize-fighter's. Neither Mr. Hance nor I said anything, out of fear of deepening the tangle. She made an uncertain move of her right hand, and I had the wild thought that she was going to give Mr. Hance one of the pennies and scoop up the 7 cents, but she didn't. She fell into a silent clinch with the situation, and then her eyes cleared. "Why, of course," she cried brightly. "I don't know what got into me. You take the 8 cents and give me a dime. Then I'll have the 2 cents that's coming to me." One of the customers laughed, and Aunt Wilma cut him down with a swift glare. The diversion gave me time to figure out that whereas Mr. Hance had been about to gain 7 cents, he was now going to lose a nickel. "That way I would be making you a present of 5 cents, Mrs. Hudson," he said stiffly. They stood motionless for several seconds, each trying to stare the other down. "Now here," said Mr. Hance, turning and taking her dollar out of the still-open cash drawer. He laid it beside the nickel and the pennies. "Now here," he said again, "you gave me $1.03. But you don't owe me $1.03. You owe me 5 cents less than that. There is the 5 cents. He snatched it up and handed it to her. She held the nickel between thumb and forefinger, and her eyes gleamed briefly as if she at last comprehended the peculiar deal, but the gleam faded. Suddenly she handed him his nickel and picked up her dollar and her 3 cents. She put the pennies back in her purse. "I've rung up the 98 cents, Mrs. Hudson," said Mr. Hance quickly. "I must put the dollar back in the till." He turned and pointed at the 98 cents on the indicator. "I tell you what, if you'll give me the dollar, I'll give you the nickel, and we'll call it square." She obviously didn't want to take the nickel or give up the dollar, but she did, finally. I was astounded at first, for here was the penny-careful Mr. Hance knocking 3 cents off a bill. But then I realized he was afraid of losing the dollar and was willing to settle for the lesser of 2 evils. "Well," said Aunt Wilma irritably, "I'm sure I don't know what you're trying to do." I was a timid boy, but I had to plunge into the snarl, if only on behalf of family honor. "Gee, Aunt Wilma," I told her, "if you keep the nickel, he's giving you everything for 95 cents. Mr. Hance scowled hard at me. He was afraid I was going to get him in deeper than he already was. "It's all right, son," he said. "It's all right." He put the dollar in the till and shoved the drawer shut with a decisive bang, but I wasn't going to give up. "Gee whiz, Aunt Wilma," I complained. "You still owe him 3 cents. Don't you see that?" She gave me the pitying glance of a superior and tired intelligence. "I never owed him 3 cents in my life," she said tartly. "He owes me 2 cents. You stay out of things you don't understand." "It's all right," said Mr. Hance again in a weary voice. He was sure that if she scrabbled in her purse again for the 3 pennies, she would want her dollar back, and they would be right where they had started. I gave my aunt a look of disenchantment. "Now, wait," she cried suddenly. "Maybe I have the exact change. I don't know what's got into me. I didn't think of that. I think I have the right change after all." She put back on the counter the nickel she had been clutching in her left hand, and then she began to peck at the coins in her purse, and after a good minute arranged 2 quarters, 4 dimes, Mr. Hance's nickel, and 3 pennies on the counter. "There," she said, her eyes flashing triumph. "Now you give me my $1 back." Mr. Hance sighed deeply, rang out the cash drawer by pushing "no sale," and handed her the $1. Then he hastily scraped up the change, deposited each coin in its proper place in the till, and slammed the drawer shut again. I was only 10, and mathematics was not my best study, but it wasn't hard to figure that Mr. Hance, who in the previous arrangement had been out 3 cents, was now out 5 cents. "Good day, Mrs. Hudson," he said grimly. He felt my sympathetic eyes on him, and we exchanged a brief, knowing, masculine glance of private understanding. "Good day, Mr. Hance," said Aunt Wilma, and her tone was as grim as the grocer's. I took the basket from the counter, and Mr. Hance sighed again, this time with relief. "Goodbye, goodbye," he said with false heartiness, glad to see us on our way. I felt I should slip him the parsley, or whatever sack in the basket had cost a nickel. "Come on, child," said Aunt Wilma. "It's dreadfully late. I declare it's taken hours to shop today," she muttered plaintively all the way out of the store. I noticed as I closed the door behind us that Mr. Hance was waiting on a man customer. The man was laughing. Mr. Hance frowned and shrugged. As we walked east on Town Street, Aunt Wilma let herself go. "I never heard of such a thing in all the born days of my life," she said. "I don't know where John Hance got his schooling, if he got any. The very idea, a grown man like that getting so mixed up. Why, I could have spent the whole day in that store, and he'd never have figured it out. Let him keep the 2 cents, then. It was worth it to get out of that store." "What 2 cents, Aunt Wilma?" I almost squealed. "Why, the 2 cents he still owes me," she said. "I don't know what they teach you young'uns nowadays. Of course he owes me 2 cents. It come to 98 cents, and I give him $1. He owed me 2 cents in the beginning, and he still owes me 2 cents. Your Uncle Herbert will explain it to you. Any man in the world could figure it out except John Hance." I walked on beside her in silence, thinking of Uncle Herbert, a balding, choleric man of high impatience and quick temper. "Now you let me explain it to your Uncle Herbert, child," she said. "I declare you were as mixed up as John Hance was. If I'd have listened to you and given him the 3 cents like you said, I'd never have got my $1 back. He'd owed me 5 cents instead of 2. Why, it's as plain as day." I thought I had the solution for her now, and I leaped at it. "That's right, Aunt Wilma," I almost yelled. "He owed you a nickel, and he gave you the nickel." Aunt Wilma stabbed me with her indignation. "I gave him the nickel," she said. "I put it on the counter right there under your very eyes, and you saw him scoop it up." I shifted the market basket to my left arm. "I know, Aunt Wilma," I said, "but it was his nickel all the time." She snorted. "Well, he's got his precious nickel, ain't he?" she demanded. I shifted the basket again. I thought I detected a faint trace of uneasiness in her tone. She fell silent and quickened her cadence, and it was hard for me to keep up with her. As we turned south into 6th Street, I glanced up and saw that she was frowning and that her lips were moving again. She was rehearsing the story of this strange transaction for Uncle Herbert. I began to whistle. "Hush up, child," she said. "I'm Figgerin." Uncle Herbert was sitting in the living room eating an apple. I could tell from his expression that he was in one of his rare, amiable moods. Aunt Wilma grabbed the basket away from me. "Now, you let me explain it to your uncle," she said. "You wait till I get back." She sailed out of the room on her way to the kitchen. A little breathlessly, I told Uncle Herbert the saga of Aunt Wilma's complicated financial quandary. He was chuckling when she came back into the room. Uncle Herbert's amusement nettled her. "The boy got it wrong," she said accusingly. "He didn't tell it right. He was every bit as mixed up as John Hance." Uncle Herbert's chuckling increased to full and open laughter. Aunt Wilma glared at him until he subsided. "Now, Herbert, you listen to me," she began, but he cut in on her. "If Hance ever gives you that 2 cents he owes you, Wilma," he said, "I tell you what you have to do to square accounts. Someday you're going to have to give him a dime for 3 cents. He began to laugh again. Aunt Wilma Hudson stared at each of us in turn with a look of fine, cold scorn, and then she raised both her hands and let them fall helplessly. "I declare," she said, "I don't know how the world gets along with the men running it." Mr. Punch. Looking for a Roman coin I had dropped on the library floor of the house I rented for the winter, I found on a shelf behind a sofa 24 immense bound volumes of Punch. They contained all the copies of the famous British weekly from the year it was founded until 1891, exactly half a century later. I picked out 3 volumes at random and began idly turning the pages of first one and then another. When the following Tuesday found me still at it, I realized what I was up to. I was getting ready to make some kind of report on Mr. Punch of the 19th century. If it has been done before, all I can say is that I am doing it again. Let us begin, then, with the tome which contains the issues from July 1889 to July 1891, and work our way back toward the Civil War. This volume, like all the others, contains some rather heavy introductory notes, summarizing what was going on in the world at the time. In this 2-year period, quite a lot was going on, if you have forgotten. The young and impetuous Kaiser Wilhelm was rattling his saber and already disturbing the peace of mind of Europe. The volume falls open easily at the double page containing Tenniel's famous cartoon, Dropping the Pilot, for it was at this time that Wilhelm got rid of Bismarck. Socialism was raising its troublesome head, so terrifying Mr. Punch that he had Tenniel draw a cartoon of a serpent, socialism, wrapped about the body of an eagle, trade, and striving to crush the bird's wings, capital and labor. The brief, sad romance of Parnell and Captain O'Shea's wife shocked the British Isles and formed a dark foil for the decorous private life of Mr. Gladstone, who, past 80 years old, celebrated his golden wedding anniversary. Tennyson, the poet laureate, became an octogenarian in his turn, and Browning died 2 years short of the mark. A potato famine was predicted in Ireland, and an epidemic of influenza held the world in what I am sure Punch somewhere or other must have called its grip. A young pianist, whom Punch laughingly alluded to as Paddy Revsky from Irish Poland, gave a concert in London, but Punch could not appraise the young man's talents because Punch did not attend the concert. Punch could report, however, that the life in Marion Crawford's latest novel was real life, and that Mr. Ibsen's A Doll's House was unutterably loathsome and should be removed from the stages of the world. The harsh effects on the feminine complexion of that new invention, the electric light, gave Punch 100 whimsical ideas, and so did the new and wonderful Eiffel Tower. One proud London paper wrote, "The Eiffel Tower is 1,000 feet high. The fourth bridge, if stood on end, would be 5,280 feet in height." Mr. Edison's phonograph was received with proper respect, Punch calling up the spirit of Faraday, who solemnly approved of the device. Montana, the Dakotas, and Washington were admitted to the Union, and the government breathed more easily when Sitting Bull was shot dead. Barnum was in London with his great show, and Millet's The Angelus was sold to an American. A hydrophobia scare led to the muzzling of all the dogs in England, and Punch came out for the much-abused Pasteur in a drawing with this dialogue between a husband and wife. "Oh, Joseph, Teddy's just been bitten by a strange dog. Doctor says we'd better take him over to Pasteur at once. But, my love, I've just written and published a violent attack upon Monsieur Pasteur on the score of his cruelty to rabbits, and at your instigation, too. Oh, heavens, never mind the rabbits now. What are all the rabbits in the world compared to our only child?" Among the minor objects of Mr. Punch's annoyance during these years were Mr. Pinero for an attack on the London music halls, newfangled barbed wire fences for interfering with fox hunting, the Americans for coining so much money and so many new words, and Count Tolstoy for a savage assault on tobacco smokers. Of this last, Punch rhymed in part, "Tolstoy knew a man who said he cut off a woman's head, but when half the deed was done, lo, the murderer's courage gone. And he finished, 'tis no joke, only by the aid of smoke." Unhorrified by murderers who got a lift from nicotine, Mr. Punch could not approve of the use of the weed by ladies, some of whom were apparently going in for cigars. "You're beautiful, but fairer far you'd be if only you would let your male friends smoke that big cigar and yield them, too, that cigarette." Most of the jokes in this volume are about bad cooks, worse painters, errant nursemaids, precocious children, insolent cab drivers, and nonchalant young blades in ballrooms. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that a great many of these young blades were named Gus. I found also, to my surprise, that the expression "I'm nuts on," meaning I'm crazy about, was used in 1891, and that the irate voice from upstairs joke began 70 years ago, unless what I ran across was just a revival of it. Stern voice from first floor landing, Tempus, 12:10 p.m. "Alice?" Alice softly. "Yes, Pa?" Voice with threatening ring in it. "Does that young man in the front parlor take tea or coffee for his breakfast?" Door, and he was gone. During the 80s and 90s, Mr. Henry James, of whom I could find no mention anywhere in Punch, was in the midst of his elaborate and delicate examinations of American ladies abroad. But Mr. Punch lashed out at them in a simpler manner. Sir James: "And were you in Rome?" American lady: "I guess not." To her daughter: "Say, Bella, did we visit Rome?" Fair daughter: "Why, Ma, certainly. Don't you remember? It was in Rome we bought the lisle thread stockings." American lady is convinced. The American male comes in for it, too. Young Britisher: "Your father's not with you, then, Miss Van Tromp?" Fair New York millionairess, one of three: "Why, no, Pa's much too vulgar. It's as much as we can do to stand Ma." Sometimes Punch had it our damsels in verse. The American girl: "She guesses and she calculates. She wears all sorts of collars. Her yellow hair is not without suspicion of a dye. Her papa is a dull old man who turned pork into dollars, but everyone admits that she's indubitably spry. She did Rome in a swift 2 days, gave half the time to Venice, but vows that she saw everything, although in awful haste. She's fond of dancing, but she seems to fight shy of lawn tennis, because it might endanger the proportions of her waist. Her manner might be well defined as elegantly skittish. She loves a lord as only a republican can do, and quite the best of titles, she's persuaded, are the British, and well she knows the peerage, for she's read it through and through. She's bediamonded superbly and shines like a constellation. You scarce can see her fingers for the multitude of rings. She's just a shade too conscious, as it seems, of admiration, with irritating tendencies to wriggle when she sings. She owns she is American, and her accent is alarming. Her birthplace is an awful name you pray you may forget. Yet, after all, we own La Belle Américaine is charming, so let us hope she'll win at last her long-sought coronet. Phil May, the great caricaturist, came back to London in the early 90s after a long stay in Australia, but his work does not appear in this volume. It could have used some. Before I leave this engrossing period of history and humor, I must quote a typical foreigner in the English home joke. This one, with its evidence of the 19th century Englishman's fine ear for the German accent, is my favorite of several hundred. Hostess: "Won't you try some of that jelly, Herr Silbermund?" Herr Silbermund, who has just been helped to pudding: "Ach, thank you, no. I would rather pair with the ills we have than fly to others we know not of." In the years 1869 to 1871, our second volume, Mr. Punch had a wealth of subjects for his little punning pieces and his big political posters. The Fenians in Ireland and America were raising hell on behalf of the freedom of Erin, and the Alabama claims case was still a sore point between England and America. Harriet Beecher Stowe, having freed the slaves, nosed about in the private life of the late Lord Byron, and provided the great scandal of the day in a magazine article revealing the love story of the poet and his half-sister, Augusta Lee. General Dan Sickles, hero of the peach orchard at Gettysburg, who was goddamning up and down the American Chancellery in Madrid as our ambassador, informed his government that the Spaniards were sore about our friendly attitude toward the Cuban insurrectionists, and might do something about it. On the 18th of July, 1870, the infallibility of the Pope was declared. On the next day, France declared war on Prussia and rushed headlong to defeat. the French mitrailleuse proving less deadly than the Prussian needle gun. Disraeli published a novel called Lothair, and made Bartlett's quotations with a crack about critics being people who have failed in literature and the arts. Oxford beat Harvard in the first crew race ever rowed between the two universities, and a small, resolute band of women began to clamor for the right to vote. Darwin's The Descent of Man was pie for the wits of Punch, and the magazine cried out against the deplorable fact that the word reliable, which it described as a new and unnecessary American adjective, was creeping into the inviolable English tongue. On top of everything, the women of England were affecting the Grecian bend, which Punch called an exaggerated forward inclination of the body, an absurd fashion of the hour. I devoted a great deal of my research to hunting down 90-year-old versions of jokes which are still going the rounds, and I offer my most cherished discovery. The curate, oh dear, drunk again, Jones, drunk again, and in broad daylight, too. Jones, Lorsh, what's the odds? So am I. You will remember this one, too. Ticket collector. Now then, make haste. Where's your ticket? Bandsman, refreshed. I've lost it. Ticket collector. Nonsense. Feel in your pockets. You cannot have lost it. Bandsman. I cannot? Why, man, I've lost the big drum. Throughout this volume, there runs a series of drawings of cute kiddies above the most distressingly cute captions. If the researcher rapidly tires of the pen and ink drawings of the famous Georges-Louis Palmé-Labousson du Maurier, the gentle, graceful satirist of modern fashionable life, it is perhaps mainly because of the gags he is given to illustrate. I select the ickiest of them. A mother is about to give a dose of medicine to a 2-year-old girl. Master George whispers, I say, Kitty, has Mama been telling you she'd give you a lovely spoonful of delicious currant jelly? Oh, so nice, so very nice. Kitty, es, currant jelly, oh, so nice, so welly nice. Master George, then don't take it. Du Maurier husbands and wives are pictured engaged in what are surely the most depressing conversations ever recorded in the history of civilized man. I quote the first, but not necessarily the worst of those I come to in my grim notes. Well, dearest, where have you been tonight? Monday pops again? No, Celia, I have spent a most instructive evening with the Anthropological Society. The how much, darling? The Anthropological, Celia. Are you deaf? How nice. And where do they anthropologe, duckums? I shall end my discussion of this fond old volume with a caption that, for its simplicity and point, rose out of these fusty yellow pages like a little cool wind. I like to think this is one the author of Trilby thought up himself. It appears under a drawing of a dowager in a carriage drawn by 2 horses and surmounted by a coachman and a footman. The lady has just given alms to a poverty-stricken woman whose ragged children are gathered about her knees. Grateful recipient, bless you, my lady, may we meet in heaven. Haughty donor, good gracious, drive on, Jarvis. It grieves me to report that Punch was unable to let it go at that. In parentheses and italics, there follows this explanatory line. She had evidently read Dr. Johnson, who didn't care to meet certain people anywhere, just in case you hadn't caught on. In the year 1863, our third and last volume runs from July 63 to July 65, the newly married Edward and Alexandra were cheered everywhere they went. The great Blondin was walking the tightrope in the Crystal Palace, and a young woman who imitated him at a small-town carnival fell and broke her neck. The Russians were beating up the Poles, and Schleswig-Holstein was the Czechoslovakia of the year, and of the next. Louis Napoleon announced that the improvements brought about by civilization would render war still more destructive. Disraeli said, the condition of Europe is one of very grave character. Let us be sure, if we go to war, first of all, that it is a necessary and just war. The Japanese killed an Englishman named Richardson, and committed a savage assault on an Englishwoman and 2 friends. Garibaldi visited London, and the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday was celebrated. Punch was irritated by the clamor in the streets caused by organ grinders and hurdy-gurdy men and hucksters selling watercress and prawns. There is no mention in the volume of what must have been to Punch one of the minor events of the early 60s, the Battle of Gettysburg. Mr. Punch's snipes and jibes at Abraham Lincoln and the causes of the North are too well known to call for an extended examination, but the researcher will cite 2 because he wants to append some notes of his own to them. Instead of habeas corpus in the United States, which has been suspended, it is now, in the case of the prisoner who is arbitrarily arrested, Abe who has corpus. Researchers note, the English government, which was apparently unswayed by Punch, suspended the right of habeas corpus in Ireland in 1866. Latest American Telegrams, 1864. Grant reduced to grunt. Sheridan's rivals successful. Hunter hunted. Pillow on Sherman's rear. Researchers note, the Encyclopedia Americana on Pillow, Gideon J., American Soldier. After 1861, he did not figure in any battle save Murfreesboro, in which he had a courtesy command. Murfreesboro was fought some 20 months before Punch's little crack. You might also be interested in a diatribe printed January 21st, 1865, and headed to the Yankee Braggarts. This American crisis is one which is only to be met by the most unmitigated swagger, and Mr. Punch, hastily constituting himself head swaggerer to the English nation, hereby answers the Yankee journals with shouts as loud and shrieks as fierce as their own. Researchers note, somebody had got off some remarks in America about our being able to lick England. War with England, indeed, you long-faced, wizened, ugly, ignorant Occidentals, defy the flag that has braved 1,000 years the battle and the breeze? Laugh at the lion and give umbrage to the unicorn? Bah, bosh, shut up, tremble. It goes on to say that one Sir Hugh Rose could go over and lick the whole United States. This happened to be the first time I had ever heard of Sir Hugh, but maybe Grant and Lee knew who he was. The end to all this is well known. Tenniel drew a touching cartoon showing Britannia laying a wreath on Lincoln's bier, and Tom Taylor wrote an equally famous and equally touching poem, eating all of Punch's nasty words and all of Tenniel's nasty drawings. This, incidentally, was the year that Alice in Wonderland was published, the book that gave Mr. Tenniel something really important to do. I find no mention of it in Punch. Lincoln and the North might be forgiven, but America's pernicious invention of new words wasn't. If the pure well of English is to remain undefiled, said Mr. Punch, no Yankee should be allowed henceforth to throw mud into it. It is a form of verbal expectoration that is most profane, most detestable. He gives you an idea of what he has in mind a few pages farther on. 2 American ladies are pictured at a dance with a young beau standing by. Says one of the ladies, under the heading, Yet Another Americanism, Here, Maria, hold my cloak while I have a fling with a stranger. American ladies were invariably represented as pretty and well-shaped. In spite of Mr. Punch's purple anger at one Nathaniel Hawthorne, sometime American consul at Liverpool, who had brought out a book about England thoroughly saturated with what seems ill nature and spite, and making a savage onslaught upon our women.